Hello again! Today I decided to make an axolotl. This creature you probably all know too well by now, as it has started to gain a lot of popularity over the years. It has become one of my favourite animals too, so let's get into it. I start off by making the base out of resin. It's 1:1 ratio and I add 2 drops of resin colourant, which is blue, so that it looks like water, as axolotls are aquatic creatures. I use this bracelet mould actually for the base. It works pretty well. To start on the body of the axolotl, I use a bit of tinfoil and roll it into this oval sort of shape. I then smack some clay to make it all nice and warm so that it can roll out and be moulded a bit better and easier, because it does tend to get a bit hard when it's cold. I roll it decently thick just to be able to cover the foil itself so that it doesn't tear when I try and blend it together. Instead of using my tools, I use my fingers to blend it as it's a bit easier, and my tools won't really get it nice and smooth as my fingers are a bit bigger. They're a bit chunkier than my tools. I do add some more clay just to bulk out the middle. I do flatten it down just by smoothing it across my table so that the base of the axolotl is, well, a bit flatter, like that. I do spend a bit of time just flattening out all the details, making sure that it looks all nice, and I also even whack the side with my rolling pin so that it has a sort of curve in it so that it's not as stiff. After shaping out the main body, I start to work on the head. I only need a tiny bit of foil for this, and then the rest is just thickened clay to kind of a flat shape, similar to just a flattened ball, with it being a bit more flat at the front where the mouth is. I then stick them together using just a bit of clay for the neck, if it really has a neck, just so that it doesn't fall off. I then keep adding a bit more clay to the head so that the top is a bit more defined. Then, using a different type of clay called Cosclay, which bends after it bakes, I start to make the tail. I don't use the Cosclay just yet, as I use it for the thinner parts on top. Poke a little hole in its butt for the tail so that it sticks in nicely and that it doesn't have a chance of falling off. Again, just more shaping out, adding little bits of detail that I can make out from images of axolotls that I have. It's very good to use reference images so that you can kind of get the hang of what you're trying to make. And then flatten out a roll of clay and stick it to the tail just by cutting down a slit in the middle and then pushing the wire into it. This will create the main middle bit of the tail, and then later, using the Cosclay, I will add 2 little fins on the top and the bottom that are a lot thinner than this part. I do use just a little bit of clay just to make sure that you can't see the wire underneath. I then attach the tail to the main body by using a bit of extra clay just so that it's a bit more of a seamless blend. I use my fingers for the most part, but then I do go on to use my tools to blend it, because as it's in a bit of a tighter area, having my tools there to use does make it just a little bit easier. At this point I use some temporary foil and wire just to hold up the axolotl so that it doesn't get smushed when I place it down on the table, because the legs do get a little bit delicate. I use wire, cut them all to size and make sure to bend them into the right shapes, and then cutting down a little slip of clay, I attach it to the arms. They look like those little tiny arms that you see on the axolotls. Now that we're getting into slightly smaller details, I do decide to switch out into my smaller silicone tools so that blending becomes just a little bit easier to get into those little cracks and crevices between the arms and the body. Now that I've added most of the main form to the body, I decide to go back to the Cosclay and cut out these little fins that are going to go on top and on the bottom of the tail. I just place them on top into the shape that I like, and then using my silicone tools again, I blend them into the regular polymer clay, the super Sculpey beneath. On some axolotls, these fins are actually a bit more transparent, but I decided not to do that as it would be a bit difficult to get the right shape out of resin or whatever other material I could do it out of. So I just decided to go with the Cosclay and paint it a slightly darker pink than the rest of the body. As the cuts on the Cosclay were quite harsh, I decided to pinch the edges so that it had more of a seamless transition to that thin edge. To make the mouth, I dug in, making these little corners, and then made sure that it had this kind of nice flowing look to the mouth, where it goes up, down, then up, and then down, and then a little bit more up, in the corners of course. Made it look like it was smiling, kind of doing that one face. And then I just make sure that it has eyes, the noses, and then of course the eyeballs themselves. Using more Cosclay, I cut out these little cone shapes where I'm going to stick them on to the little paws. I don't know if you're supposed to call them paws, but they're little hands, so that they are the little fingers and toes. From what I've seen, axolotls only have 4 fingers on the front and then 5 on each of the back legs. I do try to get all of their sizes about the same, but longer ones I do tend to put on kind of the front edges. I also use my silicone tools to blend them out into the rest of the feet and the legs. I then go in again with my silicone tool to create these lines and indents where there would kind of be ribs and bones in the axolotl. And then once that is all done, I go back after 24 hours to my resin base and I demold it from the mould. It has a few bubbles in it, but I do not mind, as it kind of goes with that water theme of it. I then take some very thin wire and start cutting it into 6 individual strands. 2 of them are large, 2 of them are medium, and then 2 of them are small, and I each bend them into these kind of wavy sort of shapes. The smaller ones are more just curves. These are actually for the gills on the front of the axolotl's face. I didn't know that they were gills, I thought they were just like little frilly bits, but it does kind of make sense that they're gills. And again, using Cosclay, I put them in after cutting a little slither down the middle. I patch it up. I then start to cut out these little triangles. These make the little frills on the side of it, where the gills, I'm assuming, collect oxygen. And I have to do it so many times, so I'll just speed it up, show you all the different sizes that I have to do, as well as I use the silicone tool to make sure that the lines aren't so harsh. I also add 2 little lines down the middle, kind of as the stem, I guess you could call it, of the frills. I'll be honest, these were probably the most time-consuming parts of the whole sculpture, but they really tie it together in the end and make it so pretty and very cute, to be honest. I really love them, despite them taking me hours to do. As you can see, the little triangles that I actually cut out from the sides get a bit thinner as you get towards the top of the gills. And then on the smaller ones, they're just tedious as it is because the triangles I had to cut out were so small all the way down. It was very difficult, but I definitely like how they look in the end. I then used my little tweezers to stick them into the head. It was a bit difficult not to smush all the details, but it's alright. Even some of them I did smush and then just had to go back in later with some of my other tools and fix them. I then realised that I had actually forgot to join the ribs up beneath, so I just went back and quickly did that, trying my best not to smush all the little details I had already made. I then used some extra clay and a spare one of these rods that I had, just to get the hole size right so that I would actually fit onto the resin base later. Now that I had added all of these final details, I went in with one of my ball tools and just run it across the entire body. I made these little dots, kind of squiggles and dots, kind of a mix, and it makes it look a bit scaly, but it kind of fits with the theme, I think. Even though I couldn't really see it on any of the reference photos, I think it really just adds a bit more texture to the axolotl. And after I've made all that texture, it went in to bake. After it's been baked, I then started to paint it. I started off with this kind of lightish pink colour, which actually turns out to be the darker pink, as I have to dry brush an even lighter pink over the top in a bit. I went over the entire body, missing out most of the areas where I used Cosclay except for the toes and the little fingers. I did end up using a sponge to even out all the texture and make sure that none of the clay kind of clumped up in areas where I didn't want it to. holding onto the body did get a little bit hard at this point, so again I just placed it down onto that little piece of wire and foil that I had, just to make it a bit easier. I then went in with that lighter colour I was telling you about and dry brushed it all over the body. To dry brush, you only need a little bit of paint on your paintbrush and just wipe it gently over detailed areas to kind of add a bit more definition between those details. I then go in with this salmon sort of pink for the gills and the fins on top of the tail. I think it definitely stands out a lot and adds a bit more variation between the different colours of the axolotl. When painting the tail, I tried to go very delicately to make these sort of clean lines between the lighter and the salmon pink, but in hindsight it didn't really matter as I was going to blend it anyways using one of my sponges later on. But to get clean lines, all you really need to do is saturate your brush all the way up to kind of the base, and then it holds a lot of paint and makes those clean lines that aren't scratchy. I did mess up a little bit when blending on the face. It's a little bit difficult using a sponge as they're a little bit thicker. This was actually a very small portion of a big sponge that I had cut out to make it a bit more manageable. But it doesn't really matter as I went back in with the much lighter pink to make the gradient a bit smoother and to push it back a little bit further as it went too close to the eyes. Of course, if you own an airbrush, it might actually be easier to use that for this, but in my opinion I prefer the look of the sponge texture as it's a bit more gritty. You can see the difference between the blend. You can tell where the darker colour is and the lighter colour is, and the blending isn't smooth, which I much prefer for this kind of sculpture. Of course, I have done once before where I tried to get it smooth as possible using a sponge, which can be a little bit hard at times. I am also very lazy and cannot be bothered to get my airbrush out for a sculpture this size. You could definitely tell how delicately I had to use the sponge so that it wouldn't overlap the colours too much. I also used a kind of mid-tone pink for the ends of the fingers and toes, just to make them look a little bit different, a bit more pinkish, very cute. And then on the eyes, it does look black, but it is kind of a very, very, very dark blue. Not that that matters because you can't really tell. I did screw up a couple times. I did overlap the eyes with the skin, and just to fix that, all I needed to use was a bit of water on my paintbrush and then wipe it around and then use a dry paintbrush to get all that water back off. Again, I just went back in and dry brushed on the gills. I then put it onto the stand, only temporarily, just so that first off I can get a feel of it and also to make putting the gloss on top easier. I wanted the axolotl to look wet, and I have this very shiny gloss that I have used in the past that achieves that effect very nicely. I did then decide to take it off the base as it wasn't too helpful being on there, especially for the underside. Then I go in with some super glue, fill up the hole, put the rod inside that hole. I held it there for just a few seconds, and then once it was partially dried, I laid it down to fully dry, and then it's done. And so the axolotl is complete. I had so much fun making this one. It's very nice doing smaller sculptures for a change. Usually I do quite big ones with a lot of detail, but doing just a singular animal and making it sort of this figure definitely was very interesting and very fun to make. As you can tell from the rod here, it's very wobbly and I really do like that detail as it gives it a little bit more movement when it's just sitting still. Thank you for sticking around so long, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like, and if you'd like to see more of this in the future, also you can subscribe, and I will try my best to give that to you. Now I hope you have an amazing day. Hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye bye!